I think our business, the aid business, Oldtown business, is still dominated by the cake, essential linear project creation of ingredients, recipe, oven, cake, which is predictable. If you follow the recipe, you get the cake. It's attributable. If you get the cake, that's because you had the right ingredients. And that's a linear project system, which is still deeply, deeply so embedded that it's almost impossible to imagine aid without projects. And so I think it's an artifact at the heart of what we do, which is causing a lot of problems when we apply it in places like this, which is a famous leaked US military PowerPoint from Afghanistan, which is a stakeholder map from Afghanistan, and a classic complex system in that there are so many connections, feedback loops, and interactions, everything responds to everything else, that when you poke the system with a lot of money or a lot of aid, effects ripple through and you cannot know what's going to happen next, and when change happens, you cannot attribute it. So we have a system in our heads based on attribution, causation, and predictability, applying to a lot of systems where that is not possible. And that produces a lot of stress and a lot of failure. So the convergence is, I think, so there's only three areas I see converging with similar conversations. There's the economic argument, that fantastic book by Eric Beinhocker, about 10 years ago now, isn't it? Arguing that economics had taken a disastrous wrong turn by deciding to be 19th century physics rather than 19th century Charles Darwin, and that we're still paying the price for that obsession with equilibrium and linearity. We got the people working on governance, institutional reform, Matt Andrews, Lamp Pritchett, and a cast of thousands, who are saying 20 years of failed institutional reform, where we're trying to insert what we consider good practice institutions into messy places, and the record is disastrous, and we've got to start in a different place. And then the third one, which is more my piece of the puzzle, which is advocacy, where I think Make Poverty History in 2005 was an example of really stupid linear campaigning, which was also extraordinarily arrogant and northern. And so this isn't official Oxfam line. We're very proud of our campaigning in 2005. But it was basically saying if we sort out aid, debt and trade, we will make poverty history, which is such an extraordinarily stupid statement. It just doesn't bear scrutiny. How people have, the journey people have gone on is saying linear's no good, predictive's no good, we've got to do something else. They've often then moved into what are the bottlenecks? Yeah, the sort of Danny Roderick growth bottlenecks approach, where what are the bottlenecks, the pinch points which we can attack to free up the animal spirits of the system, wherever it is. And that's sort of a problem-fixing approach. And then beyond that, now I think where we're at is, oh no, it's actually more complex than that. And if we look more widely at systems, we start spotting new opportunities, we start being agile, and we start getting cleverer. Some of the common features in these three discussions: power. So power bubbles up, often bubbles away again, because it's quite difficult to get our heads around, especially if you're in a bilateral herder aid situation. But understanding power as the sort of force field of development underlying a lot of the change processes we're involved in, and how power is renegotiated and in flux, is, I think, very useful, certainly in social and political, I think also in economic. The importance of discontinuity, shocks and critical junctures of change. How do we prepare ourselves for those moments of opportunity, those unexpected or expected opportunities? And are we actually set up to take advantage of those discontinuities, or do we just grind on with the plan regardless? Adaptive programming, all the rage. People mean entirely different things when they use the phrase, which is always encouraging because that means everyone can agree with it. But in some sense of making it up as you go along, kind of noticing what's happening in the system and feeding that back into what you're doing is definitely happening across all those three areas. People are agonizing about timescale. So if all the interesting changes take 20 years, how on earth do we put that into a project? And how do you know after 2 years whether you're going to achieve an interesting change after 20 years or whether your project is rubbish? It's really, really big, challenging questions. It's very easy to say, oh, we're also short-termist. Just try being long-termist and see how that goes for you. Attribution and causation, elusive, to put it mildly. Success has many fathers, failure is an orphan, and we sort of turn that into our reporting mechanisms. there's a lot of interest and energy around convening and brokering, the sense of the role of outsiders being to get everybody in the room, agree a common problem definition, and see what happens, rather than we will roll out our project. A lot of questions around how you do that, convening and brokering, I think. And then something which is coming up more and more, which hasn't possibly been recognised in some of these discussions, which is it keeps coming back to HR, keeps coming back to people and relationships, and if you haven't got the right people, it doesn't matter how clever your plans are, and that's actually a massive challenge, because I'm not sure we do have the right people in most situations. And you can't just turn them into the right people by subjecting them to enormous numbers of workshops. So I think there's some real questions there. I'm the light entertainment, right? You get the proper stuff. So, dilemmas. One interesting thing I've noticed, I wrote a paper on donor theories of change on social and political action in fragile and conflict-affected states, which surprisingly has not done very well in terms of readership. But it was interesting because in messy places, when donors are trying to get activism of some kind, half of them are saying, we've got to understand that Afghan map, we've got to understand the complex system, and then come up with a really complex intervention in lots of different places at once, maybe have multiple parallel experiments with fast feedback loops and fix it. And the other half is saying, don't be stupid, you're never going to be there, you're an outsider, you're never going to understand the system well enough. How do you do enabling environment? How do you make it possible for endogenous change to bubble up more successfully by doing very basic stuff like access to information, legal reform, whatever it is, and just leave the rest of the system because you can't do it. And I think that division is opening up now. It's not yet mature, but I think it's interesting the way it goes. Another interesting dilemma, I think, is some of the most interesting stuff on systems is about intense listening. So that fantastic book, Portfolios of Rapport, keeping financial diaries with 4 people over a year and discovering an entire ecosystem of finance which we didn't know about before. Or positive deviance, where you go and look for positive outliers on any given issue. Before you even think about a project, just go and see where the system is solving the problem for itself. Versus a lot of what the adaptive program people are saying is just jump in and start, and then you'll learn by doing, because you actually can never do enough ex-ante study to actually get it right first time. And I think there's a tension there between how much listening and looking and how much just get started. Huge questions on whether any of this is possible in the aid business, because there are all these countervailing forces on fear, weak political consensus behind it, value for money, minimizing risk. DIPA just got slapped by the IDC, the International Development Committee, for saying that they only 0.03% of its budget has been lost to fraud, and IDC said, rubbish. That's just not credible. And I think there's a real question here that if you have a zero tolerance of risk, corruption, or anything bad, how do you then get experimental and risky and entrepreneurial? I don't think that adds up. And then scale. I do not understand how scale fits into all this. I'd love to hear that. Scale is a good thing. We like scale, but scale is not a rolling out. Scale is something else which somehow inheres in this adaptive programming world. And I think there's a big discussion to be had there. And I'll stop there.